Hi. So the first source that I chose to best represent my learning process throughout the course was actually one of the first sources that we addressed. It's Hadley Friedland's second chapter, the Wetiko, I'm not sure how to pronounce it out loud really, Wetiko as a Legal Concept or Category, from her 2018 book, The Wetiko Legal Principles, the Cree and Anishinabek Responses to Violence and Victimization. This source really blew me away, actually, at the start of the course, because it addressed sort of head-on, threw us right in the deep end, talking about some of the issues we would talk about later in the course, from indigenous practices to the healing process, the incorporation of indigenous perspectives in the criminal justice system, and sort of the typical colonial settler perceptions of the indigenous practices. So coming into the course, I didn't have a lot of conceptions about indigenous life or its institutions, particularly talking about indigenous law and criminal justice, which this source talked a lot about. Wasn't a lot of formal education about indigenous society in my high school or anything like that. And so probably most of my knowledge about indigenous institutions was coming more informally, whether it's through the sort of light Canada history that you get, which obviously comes from a colonial perspective, or outdated portrayals like Pocahontas or something like that. So it was really fascinating to read this chapter because it picked apart some of those conceptions that I may have had about indigeneity and the Wetiko that would have portrayed this sort of, to call it a phenomenon in a dismissive way, in a crude way, in an offensive way. But I think Friedland really touched on it, that it was sort of part of that settler mindset when they looked at the Wetiko in this way and sort of dismissed it. And that settler mindset, and we would talk about later in the course, which fueled the establishment of legal and criminal justice institutions that were entirely exclusive of indigenous perspectives, much to the detriment of indigenous people that would become involved in these institutions. So it was really interesting to see the author reframe the Wetiko, both the actors and then how this indigenous society would address the Wetiko, and sort of frame it as being fundamentally the same as what settler society has in terms of being a legal practice and part of the legal institutions, and that they were practicing a sophisticated form of criminal justice where they identified, addressed, and not so much prevented, but they really looked at the Wetikos in much the same way that settler society at the time and that now looks at criminals. And frankly, this is the first book or article or probably media that I ever had that really explained that indigenous society did and still does have institutions that are as important, as effective, perhaps more so, and as integral to their society as what settler society has and had. Which is sort of, this being the first thing, was sort of reflective of the ways in which indigenous voices and perspectives are ignored and excluded from Canadian consciousness through formal education, and sort of excluded in the criminal justice system as well.